All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Deborah Collier, Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for Citizens Against Government Waste. Welcome to Free the Economy, Deb.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's talk about the internet. Uh, Not too long ago, we saw a vote from the Federal Communications Commission to impose or reimpose what we call net neutrality regulations on internet service providers. And people who have been around for a while might be in a case of deja vu because we had the FCC had a complicated proceeding on that. And I thought we had settled that back in December of 2017. Um, but that was under a former FCC chairman, Ajit Pai. But now it's back. So what do we need to know about it?
What you need to know is this is an absolute waste of taxpayer resources redoing what was overturned back in 2017. The internet sky did not fall on our heads. We were not dished out one word at a time. All the bad things that were supposed to happen in 2017 after the Restoring Internet Freedom Order was adopted did not occur. Instead, what happened was companies invested more in infrastructure, more in research and development. They created a very vibrant ecosystem for the internet that has allowed us to enjoy a lot more access than what we had even before 2017. And with that investment, we were able to literally survive the pandemic of 2019, 2020, 2021, when everybody hunkered in, stayed at home, worked from home, educated at home. Everything was online. And without the investments made by the private sector, we would not have been able to do a lot of the things that we were able to continue doing even through the quarantine periods and all of that.
So yeah, you reminded me just as you were doing your intro there that there were a lot of scary predictions by people who wanted the FCC to impose net neutrality rules, saying, well, if the government, is not controlling the terms of agreements by how internet service providers, allow people to connect to the internet, then you're going to have to pay, $5 for every Google search, or your all your internet is going to go extremely slow. Everyone's going to have to pay way more. Obviously, we didn't see that. Um, you know, I wonder, did some of the people who got so worked up about net neutrality, which apparently was, towards the end of 2017 seemed like it was the greatest human rights issue of our time. Um, did they, do you think everyone believed it would be that terrible? Or do you think it was just a sort of like they wanted to stick it to what they thought were like big, big greedy internet corporations and that
You
was
know,
and that was sort of like all there is to it. It was just anti-corporate vibes.
there was a lot of anti-corporate vibes. And I think a lot of this is driven by the extreme factions of the country that would like to see the government take over the internet. It which of course, can you imagine if the government operated your internet service? We're watching the IRS. They can't even process our tax returns. What makes us think that they're going to be able to operate as vast of a network of communications as the internet? But I think that's what's really driving this is that, there's a desire to have the government own and operate the networks that we rely on.
It's interesting because people who are certainly in favor of, government funding for things like research and development technology will say, oh, but look at the internet. The internet itself was based on earlier computer networks that was developed as part of a defense research project. And that's, therefore, everything that we have on the internet today is really a government project. Um, I mean, it's true that, DARPA existed and ARPANET
Hmm.
existed, and there were like a handful of computer science professors who used it for research as well as government defense officials. But obviously, the consumer internet, as we know it today, is not primarily a government initiative, right?
No,
Um, all the all the all the websites, all the cloud computing, all the services, all the streaming media, all of that stuff is driven by consumer preferences, right?
hmm,
As well as the advances, like you pointed out, the billions of dollars investment in infrastructure and greater speeds, greater capacity that so many people depended on during the pandemic when we were all at home and interacting with each other virtually. Uh, Clearly, that is the result of private enterprise, private investment, and uh, possibly the most important part of all this, which you point out, which you don't really get from the IRS and the DMV, which
hmm,
is a consumer focus, right? The government has
right.
certain things, it has certain important jobs to do, but they're generally not, they're more law enforcement focused and not really consumer preference focused. All right, but that's what we depend on these private companies for. And so, in some cases like this where you have a proposal to come in and have the government regulate private industry, it seems to me like they sort of want it both ways, right? They want all the authority to boss people around, but they don't want to have any responsibility for the content or actually producing things consumers actually want.
Right.
They just want to sort of like hold the reins. And and you know, I wonder if there is sort of a lesson to be learned there about regulation in general, or things you can apply to other industries.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that because as I was getting ready for this discussion, I was thinking about Wayne Cruz and his 10,000 Commandments book that CEI puts out every year, and thinking, that with all these regulations that the federal government is issuing every year, I think he said in his most recent edition there were 265 new significant regulations
Mhm.
um, in the second year of the Biden administration. That's a lot of
Mhm.
significant regulations. It makes you wonder how overstretched the federal government's becoming and how overreaching the federal government is becoming into our daily lives.
Well, yeah, and I also sort of wonder how much of what these proposals are focused on involves solving an actual problem as opposed to just inserting the federal government into sort of management role in the economy just because that makes some people feel better. Um, because we have through the entire history of consumer internet from the launch of the World Wide Web and all of the internet service providers that exist today, from the 90s, we've had a long history of expanding internet access, increasing download speeds, all of that stuff. All of those metrics have been getting better over time.
Mhm.
And so I wonder what, even from the view of someone who is in favor of net neutrality regulations, either back in 2016, 2017, or now with this renewed FCC vote today, what problem are they actually solving?
They're not.
Mhm.
They're not solving any problem. Like I said, the only reason to do this is to have the government take control of the internet. There's no problem out there. Any consumer-based issues are usually, like a few customers that want faster service for a lower price, or, want maybe they've got an internet outage for a day or two because somebody cut their cable line, which I've had happen. I think we've all experienced the internet outages because a construction crew cut their cable line. I live near an interstate and they're constantly digging it up, and the next thing I know, my internet's down because somebody cut the line. Um, so, but those are consumer complaints that can be taken to their provider first. And then if they don't get resolution and the provider doesn't respond back to them, then maybe they can go through the complaint mechanisms at the agencies. But the solution is not to impose these Title II common carrier, heavy-handed government may I set of rules on the internet, because then every single investment that a communication company wants to make relating to the internet is going to have to go through the top-down chain of command at the FCC to get approval.
Mhm.
And we know how quickly technology evolves. If you have that type of top-down approval approach to, getting permission to innovate, then innovate's going to stop.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I think this we can sort of see this in the way the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission approve or don't approve business deals like mergers and acquisitions for antitrust reasons. You every new big corporate change in strategy would then become a lobbying fight, right? Where you'd
Mm-hmm.
have to like hire PR agencies and lobbying agencies to try and pressure the commission into, making the right decision that you like, and that, your opponents in another industry or even within the same industry would then have the incentive to make this a political PR fight to say like, oh, well, the commission shouldn't approve your proposal to change the way you do internet streaming because it might be bad. So then people will be more likely to use our service instead.
Mm-hmm.
It seems not ideal.
Yeah, and it's akin to crony capitalism. It's akin to regulate my competitor, but don't regulate me.
Mhm.
Um, it just makes for bad public policy all around.
So, is there a way to get out of this sort of back and forth policymaking where we have one administration does it in one direction and then another administration comes by a few years later and then a different FCC majority does the exact opposite? Do we need, terrifying that I'm suggesting this, but do we need Congress to like write some bills saying stop going back and forth, don't do this?
Equal terrified about saying that. I think we've reached that point. We always try to, hope that Congress is not going to make bad laws. And, we generally, if they're good laws, you want to be supportive. Well, in this instance, we've got an unelected set of 5 commissioners who are determining the course of action of something of such major economic impact that Congress must step in. And, I know the Senate has, approved their nominations to the commission. I get that. But that doesn't give them leeway to become Congress just
Mhm.
because the Senate approved their nominations. This, the internet, regulating the internet has such an enormous impact on the lives of every single American, economic impact on the lives of every single American, that how it is regulated must be determined by Congress. And it is long past overdue to get this done, because we cannot leave consumers and businesses in limbo, not knowing from one minute administration to the next how the internet is going to operate.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're long past due.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there's an argument that this issue is too important to ignore because the internet is sort of like the backbone of our modern economy. But on the other hand, internet service providers aren't necessarily they're not the sort of specialist snowflake in the economy. I mean, I think there's an argument to say that they should be regulated by a completely, again, neutral set of rules, just like anybody else. That we should have like basic rules that say you can't defraud a person. You have to be, if you say you're going to sell someone a service at a certain price, then you have to actually deliver. But the, you know, there's an argument here. We don't need special rules for the internet for internet competition at all because we don't have grocery neutrality. There's not rules about like that every store has to sell you a can of soup for the same price. There's no car dealership neutrality that says every single car has to be sold in the same way to the same sort of customer in every state and every locality. Um, part of the problem out here, I think is that we have too much of this sort of like industry specific, sector specific uh, regulation that's driven by, you know, in some cases not very serious sort of consumer complaints, that maybe we could simply dispose of by saying, well, we have rules against fraud, we have rules about transparency and advertising, and the Federal Trade Commission has these broad rules that just say in general businesses are supposed to do this and not do these other bad things that we all agree on. So can we have that for the internet? Can we just say, well, we're going to have a rule for internet companies offering their services that isn't even internet industry specific, that are just these are just rules of the road?
That's basic general business practices,
Mhm.
with, the general rules of the road. In 2005, under then Chairman Powell, the FCC did issue some guidance on how companies should operate on the internet. And, they were four basic principles that, you don't throttle, you allow any device to access you that's lawful to access, lawful content. You can access lawful speech, you can access, and so they were very good guidance and they worked really well. The fact that, in 96, when it was first opened up for public use, Bill Clinton even said, it's an information service. It's not a telecommunications service. And that's what got this whole ball rolling. And that allowed innovation to occur. It allowed the vibrancy of the ecosystem to broaden and expand. I mean, back then the internet was a wire you plugged into your house that then went to your computer. And today we get it on our mobile devices. We can get it via satellite. There's so many ways to access the internet now. And I don't know that those technologies would have evolved if they had been imposing these very strict Title II telecommunications rules on the internet.
Mhm. And I think you sort of hinted at this earlier, but I'm sort of interested in the sort of turning this presumption in the opposite direction. So you've got policymakers in Congress and in the FCC over the years who've had a lot of proposals for regulating
Mhm.
tech and telecom companies, including these like Title II net neutrality regulations. But what about the federal government itself? And it's something that I think you know a little bit about how IT systems and management systems work in federal government, federal agencies. Um, does the federal government have a lot of credibility when it comes to telling other technology companies how to run their systems? Because it seems like we've had certain issues with with privacy and just even with usability and things over the years. How would you rate the federal government tech IT innovation agenda?
You really want to know? I'm thinking a D to a D minus,
Mhm.
um, just because, a lot of these systems are from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and haven't been modernized. Even though Congress has been throwing money at modernization efforts, the federal agencies are very slow to take up these modernization funds to improve their systems. The master death file is decades old, and a lot of these other systems are running on COBOL, which or Fortran, which are two programming languages that were, the underlying programs that were, I mean, we don't even have people who know how to program those things anymore unless they're in the federal government ready to retire.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I learned back in college some of these basic programming languages and never used them again since, and I worked in IT.
Mhm.
So, these are the things that the federal agencies should be focusing on, is modernizing their IT systems, upgrading their networks, making sure that their systems are secure. How many data breaches has the federal government encountered over the last 20 years?
Mm,
We've had the IRS have data breaches. We've had the VA have data breaches. We've had OPM have data breaches. They contain a lot of information about individual Americans.
mm,
So, the federal government needs to get its own house in order before it starts taking on, you know, building out networks or creating their own software like the IRS is currently doing with their new um, program to fill out and prepare people's tax returns for
mm.
them. So, there's, you know, they just really need to look at their priorities and really get their priorities straight at the federal level.
Well, yeah, and this has come up this is a little somewhat to the side of what our conversation's been around so far, but I've mentioned that it's come up in other policy debates about uh, programs that federal government has proposed, the idea that well, we're going to set up a new database to track this, or we're going to set up a new database to record every American's information about that, or we had an interview few episodes ago with where we were talking about central bank digital currencies, where you would have then the Federal Reserve would have a database with every dollar in the economy would be tracked,
Oh
and
my
be
God.
connected to like the person who's using it, and even if there's sort of two questions there. One, would this be a good idea, even in a perfect world? But the more realistic question is, given that we do have an imperfect world and we have a highly imperfect history of federal government IT infrastructure, what would a proposal like this, like expanded databases for all sorts of different topics, what would that actually look like? And I think that the history, like you said, the number of data breaches in the past 20 years of big, comprehensive, detailed federal government databases is reason for us to be skeptical of any of these big ideas that the government would build some new master society-wide database of American citizens.
That's just scary. I'm just throwing that out there. That's just scary idea. Considering that, they can't even protect taxpayer information, veterans information, even their own employees'
Mhm.
information, their retirees' information. The idea that they will be tracking every single transaction an American makes, that is really a frightening thought.
So, well, that is still hopefully a ways off. There is a question about what should the FCC be doing, right? Because we do have an FCC, right? It
Hmm.
has a certain mandate, it has a certain job to
Right.
do. Um, uh, so imagine if you were, you're like appointing all five FCC commissioners all at once or something, and you're able to sort of, kind of set an outlook and a focus. What would you put on that policy and planning agenda? These are the things the FCC should be doing for the American people.
Well, first thing they need to be doing is getting prepared with spectrum in a pipeline. And I know they rely on Congress for the authority to do this, but they need to be looking at available spectrum that can be used for either licensed or unlicensed purposes. As we use the technologies that are driving the economy, there is a lack of available spectrum. And the federal government is one of the biggest holders of spectrum. You think that the companies have a lot of it. Well, they
Mhm.
have enough to get by for now. But as we expand our use of devices, in our homes, even our cars, when we're out and about in the world, unlicensed and licensed spectrum are really critical means to keep us connected when we need to be connected. And so the FCC needs to be focused on spectrum allocations. They also should be improving the broadband mapping that they're doing. And, that's got to be a continual process, because as more federal dollars are being spent to expand broadband, they need to make sure that once the areas are connected, that it's noted in those maps. So
Mm.
this is an ongoing process. They also need to be focused on ensuring that we stay at the leadership level internationally. We led on 4G. We were leading on 5G, but then the spectrum auctions got halted. Other things occurred, and now we've got other countries that are trying to take over that leadership role. And I'm talking about China, Russia, North Korea, these areas of the world that aren't exactly friendly to the US. And if they take on the leadership for spectrum allocations, then it puts the US at a huge disadvantage internationally because they're going to be setting the standards
Mm.
for all the equipment that goes into these networks.
Oh yeah, and going going back just one step where you were talking about the uh, broadband mapping of having a sort of accurate understanding of in all different parts of the country, different communities, who has broadband access, and what's considered to be the sort of like the gold standard access or the minimum necessary to like keep up with the internet. Um, I think one of the things that people sort of thought they liked about net neutrality was that even people who weren't sort of deep into the kind of the technical details of it, they kind of considered it a sort of an egalitarian thing, that it would be good for underserved communities, or would make it easier for people to connect to the internet, and that it would sort of democratize things. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for that, for policy
Mhm.
sort of like that in general. But I think maybe a lot of people don't know that the federal government already spends a lot of money on subsidizing broadband and rolling out to quote designated underserved communities and things like that. Um, and so there's I think a little bit of a mismatch with the understanding that that we live in some sort of Dickensian struggle for survival, where no one's helping anyone, and there's no government assistance, and we're all just at the mercy of whatever the big sort of faceless telecom company is. But there's quite a bit that's being done, and it's been done for a long time. There's billions of dollars that are waiting to be spent, and it's almost the question of whether in some places there's too much money, because there's so much funding in some places. There's been questions by a lot of people whether states and localities and other decision-making bodies are actually making wise use of the money that's there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of this, a lot of what you're talking about is through the National Telecommunications Information Administration. They're operating the funding or issuing the funding for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And we've actually been tracking how much those allocations are, and how much of the funds per residential unit is being allocated. So like, we're finding some areas of the country, mostly in rural areas, are spending far less than in urban areas, which to us doesn't quite make sense. That, a residential unit in a more densely populated area is that the federal dollars are that much higher. And we're talking about significantly different. In fact, we're tracking that on our website at cagw.org. Our state policy associate, Alec Mena, he's been really doing a deep dive into all the applications that states are submitting. So it's been kind of eye-opening. We're still delving into the data on that, but yeah, it's interesting to see how those federal dollars are being allocated.
All right. Well, Deb, this has been an excellent conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot as well. Before we go, tell us, where should people find you and your work online?
Again, we are at cagw.org. And again, I'm Deborah Collier with Citizens Against Government Waste.
All right, excellent. Deb, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.